All right. Well, it's a very beautiful night, and I am sitting down, tackling this next part of Who is God, like the series on Who is God. And I expect this to be going on for around 45 minutes, so by all means, put this in while you're driving and just listen to it, or put it somewhere else and play a game or whatever. But hopefully, this will explain more on some things that are very important. This is important because the thing is, there will be a point in most everyone's life where they ask themselves why they are here. Like, what is the point of me being here, like alive? And to be honest, it's defined usually by the relationships and by the journey that one takes. This is incredibly important. That takes time, maturity, experience. Like, all of this is needed. I would have to say there are lessons too that each person seems to learn, and they're imparted a little bit differently throughout the ages, as well as because everyone has different mentors, different ways they learn, different the those and what that they come in contact with them. They impart different lessons or the same lessons different ways. It's both of those. And when it comes down to it, Christianity is different in the sense that it's been described as more of a relationship rather than a faith or a religion because of how intensely personal that the interaction between you and the God that you believe in actually is. Also, there's no other religion or faith that has God or the Son of God coming down to sacrifice himself for the people. That part is still something very unique and interesting because having the Creator basically die or sacrifice a part of himself for the people is just, it's very different. It's very unique. It's not something you hear about. And it is intensely personal because it's very, it's intimate, but it's in a way where it's transparent, to the point where God ended up ripping the curtains between the innermost holy place of the temple at the time with the outer place, the outer courts. And it's something that was signified as a opening where people could come and freely understand and worship God without a need for a priest or someone who is in between them. And there's a lot to say there about who God is as far as what all he encompasses. Now, I would have to say that it could also be like, what is God as well, because there is authority position with God that should be made clear. There's the Father, there's the Son, there's the Holy Spirit. We don't know who else there could also be or what other positions there are. Like the spirit of death. Is that an aspect of God that calls others to home? There's a Bible verse that says that the death of his children is something that matters very much to him. It's very important to him. And I have theories that when God calls someone home, it's usually done in a way where it's not a process, but it's more of like, I don't know how to describe it. It's just that he cares for the passing of each person. And I want to say that there's no pain involved, but in all honesty, I think God's just personally involved with each person's passing. All right. Let's see here. I have in front of me a Bible translation that I like using, which is the AMP version. It reminds me of the energy drink, but it's also very in-depth and hard-hitting to a point that I just don't really see any other translations use, in case you're wondering. I also have here a list of the books of the Bible that I would recommend not going from Genesis to Revelations as far as a study guide. I wouldn't recommend that, no. But I would say that when it comes down to it, there's a lot that you should look into because the stories here are incredible. The lessons here are equally incredible. And I would have to say that Solomon, who wrote the Book of Solomon's, the collections that are made into the book, he's on par with very few other writers, very few others who are of his intellect. And the fact that some very important people, like the Queen of Sheba, ended up visiting him, is proof of this. That, I believe, is recorded. The fact that, people ended up visiting him to hear his wisdom, to be able to sit down and converse with him, is something that is very interesting. And the fact that this man's wisdom was gifted to him. And I say wisdom, not knowledge, because he did not learn a lot of this the hard way or through experience the way that most people would have. I believe he was distinctly gifted with a portion of the Holy Spirit to a different degree than that of what Samson was gifted, which was an aspect of God's strength. And the fact that it's been made, the fact that Samson was probably had a very frail frame that was kind of on the weak side. So people were always wondering how he could be so strong with such a frame. That is an interesting topic for another discussion, though. I would have to say, though, when it comes down to it, it's interesting to note that God does not have a physical body that is limited. So when I say who God is, but also it could also fall on to what God is, I am simply trying to expand upon the fact that the identity of God could be a lot more expansive than what we know of or are aware of. Songs talks about praise and worship of God. Very good points to be made there, as well as a reminder to be joyful and thankful for who he is and what he's done. Proverbs, wise sayings from a man who is gifted a portion of God's Spirit. That's my understanding. Anyway. Job, a story of trial and hardship where God was with him till the very end, where he then came to Job and then his friends later, but saying that I want you to brace yourself because I have some questions here that are very important. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? And there's other questions that set things up to where God points out the fact that he is an author, he is a creator. He has an aspect that is very different from others that has not really been talked about. I mean, there's other religions out there that talk about earth and how it's created and all that, but not from an aspect where a God was actually involved. One God specifically. It's usually multiples. But anyway, that's besides the point. God being a creator and a builder, setting frameworks and foundations in place that are very meticulous and extremely particular. I don't know if the number 7 is relevant at all, but it's been noted that it is. To what degree, I don't really know. But the measurements for the way things are made is also of interest too. Let me see here. So the point I'm trying to make here is he didn't just simply just make and create everything, but he also designed and gave them purpose and function. From basically the living organisms, like, people, all the way to the vegetation and to the way the world, the universe, and the solar system, how they all operate. Like the properties of space, and not just, Earth itself. Let's see here. Anyway, Genesis is from the very beginning, and it's a great place to start. It really is, because it starts from basically how everything was formed and the roles and purposes of man and how women came into being, which are effectively helpers, equals helpers. Um, then it talks about Exodus and some very good stories there, and it's a transitional period. Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy talk a lot about rules and regulations that the Israelites had to observe. And a lot of this, also the Passover too, which came before Christ, and then when Christ came, basically his death and his resurrection fulfilled a lot of that. The thing is, a lot of what the Israelites had to follow, I would say the Jews at this point, a lot of the Jewish people have to follow now is more for tradition, and it's not really for health related reasons like it was back then. A lot of it was health related, avoid certain types of meat, avoid doing this to be unclean, that sort of thing. And if you ever became unclean, you had to purify yourself. So a lot of that is very understandable, for health based reasons. It's why the same reason you wash your hands when you go use the restroom. Let me see here. Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. There's Joshua. There's Judges. First, Second Samuel. They talk about the leaders, and the fact that God is a leader is something that is very underappreciated, because He often takes charge in situations that you don't really expect. Not just simply when you pray and you hope you hope to get a response back, but the fact that God is a leader is something that I want to say men discover more than women, simply because of their roles and their purpose and what they do in life is usually very different. Women are not necessarily called to leadership in the way that men are. And it differs from what Paul talks about in the Bible about how, I'm going to probably get this wrong, so apologies, but he talks about how women should be seen but not heard. And he goes at it from a perspective of how a wife should be from a biblical point of view. Again, apologies if I get any of that wrong. I want to try to be as accurate as I can. Let's see here. So, yeah, moving on. Leadership position of God is something that is unique because God, what is the purpose and point of a role, like for leadership? God doesn't need that. He's doing it specifically, not for himself anyway, maybe for those that he created, like the angels. I mean, he definitely needs to be number one because, Satan, demons, and the fact that there is a whole other faction out there that needs to be dealt with. They need to be kept in check, more or less. In other words, it's the fact that he fell from the presence of God and changed from who he was to who he is now, and the fact that he has dominion over a portion of this earth is something that is important. He does not have control over the people who live on it, but he does have control over a lot else. It's the fact that his character and his leadership skills are there is still very much important, even if it's just not really talked about much. So him taking charge and him telling us sometimes, and I mean us as telling the people in the Bible, there's sometimes where he says, I want you to do this, to stand still and let me fight your battles for you. And then other times he gives them strict regulations on what to do and how to do them. Like walking around the walls of Jericho, for 3 days. A certain amount of time within these 3 days. And then to blow their trumpets at specific points. All of this was done in faith that God would come through for him, which he did. So, God asking us to follow him through faith with acts and events that go hand in hand with this. He won't always do things the way that we expect, though. With the story of the fleece that was being used to determine whether or not God was speaking to, I'm blanking on his name here, but it was a leader. He was one of the leaders, one of the leaders of Israel in the book of Judges. There's a lot of them too. So, point in case, the way he goes about leading other people as well as nations is very interesting on who he chooses to be as his instrument in the events that he chooses to participate in or not participate in. Because leading up to the New Testament, God was very quiet. He didn't send prophets. It was just like a period of, I don't know, I can't even describe it. It was a period of silence, I guess. But there were still Jewish leaders, and there were, let me see here, there were the Pharisees, and then there were the Sadducees. So both sides were equally important, but they branched off into different ways on how they believed, what they believed. I want to say that the Sadducees believed that God was less involved than the Pharisees, their counterparts. Anyway, moving on here. Past the leaders phase, there are the individual stories that are incredible. Nehemiah with rebuilding. Esther with being in a very powerful position, and the story that is very unique, very different. Ruth from a very humble origins. There's Maccabees here that's mentioned, but it's not a book of the Bible, and I don't know anything about it, but it's worth mentioning. Let me see here. Psalms with praises. Proverbs, wise sayings. So God, showing an aspect of God in all of these is the entire point of why I'm going through this. From praise, from wise advice, from stories, all the way down to revelation with like prophecies, the future. Because someone who knows the past, who knows the present, because my understanding is God made us all. He understands what we are like. He understands what we could make in every possible instance in this situation. All the way from likes to values and points that we focus on when we make decisions. All of this stuff God understands, which is how he is able to plan things out, because it's not unknown to him. If he understands how someone operates and he understands the values and all of that, which he does, then, or should I say, there's a lot of evidence that leads to the fact that he does. There's probably a lot more, and I would rather just not simply be cut and dry, very simple with, yes, God understands, and just leave it like that. That's not very helpful at all. Let me see here. Lamentations, grieving, being able to go through going through the hard times, like the loss of someone very close. I lost a friend who was very close, and frankly, time and space is needed to grieve and to let go, to process what has happened, to understand your place in all of this, to go back to God, being able to. There is a lot that comes into when it comes down to an aspect of God that deals with healing, that deals with healing, forgiving, letting go. So I want to say like a bit of a counselor side of God, which mainly deals with the Holy Spirit from my understanding, but is still very much underrated, because being able to place people in situations for healing and for growth Um, it's very much needed, but people don't really talk about it much. It's not, there's multiple reasons why. Like, it's just too hard. It's too difficult. I don't have time for it. You got to focus on life. Well, all of those are true, but you're just gonna have to figure out where a lot of this applies to you personally. It's when it comes down to counseling, it's very detailed and very personal for each and every person. Let me see here. I would have to say a process of rebuilding and of, like, in the case of Ezekiel and Nehemiah and Ezra, rebuilding can take years, but it's very much important because of what we've lost, what we've been through. This is both on a personal level as well as like a national level, like with your country. Um, I'm particularly thinking of the country of Israel that was recognized years ago. I don't remember the exact year, but years ago as a country finally for in who knows how long. Just an example. There's a lot of prophets: Obadiah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk. There's books that talk about prophets in their life and all that. So, like, dealing with warnings and with the future and trying to call back someone that you love into a relationship that you once had is another aspect of God that isn't really talked about much. It's important though because, God cares. If God didn't care, why would he go through all this trouble anyway? Like, it makes no sense, right? Now, to be fair, there is a portion mixed in with all of this, the fact that God wants to be recognized for who he is and his position, his authority, which is why, there are certain aspects that he does want kept personal. He does not ever want shared with anyone or anything else, which is understandable. If you were a leader, if you were God yourself, and you want to be praised and worshipped, that's your right, because you made everything, you create everything, and it's basically yours. Anyway, moving on. Revelation is very unique in the sense that, again, dealing with the future isn't really cut and dry as other people would say. The fact that it ties in with dreams and visions is also of interest because you're going from what is written, what is spoken, to what is seen, and what has been possibly have gone to a different place in time to actually see what has happened. That is very much up for debate because the way people are, like, the mind can be very manipulated. So God could very much have put something within. I'm forgetting who was there talking about his experience in Revelation. I want to say it was Jeremiah, but I believe I'm completely wrong on that. Either way, going back in time and seeing what he saw and then writing it down is incredibly amazing. And honestly, there's a lot to talk about there. Having these visions and trying to make sense of them first and foremost is incredibly difficult. And writing down what he saw and being very descriptive about it is important. However, people argue whether or not it's a literal translation. It could be metaphorical and actually be a representation. It may not actually physically exist. like for example, talking about the red dragon trying to swallow up the sun when the woman gave birth to it, and then spewing rivers out of its mouth. That right there is probably not very literal at all. It's a representation of Satan chasing after trying to devour Jesus when he was born. That's the given interpretation anyway. Moving on to the Bible verses themselves. Since I'm breaking this down, I'm saying, hey, these are good for Bible studies. Go check them out. All right. Let's see here. 1 John 4:8. The one who does not love has not become acquainted with God. Parentheses. Does not and never did know him. For God is love. Parentheses. He is the originator of love, and it is an enduring tribute to his nature. Love is a part of who he is, not just simply being a builder, being a counselor, being a judge. I would have to say that love is built throughout all of this, because putting down rules basically to condemn what God hates or what is very much against him, and much more, because sin, wrongdoing, all of that breaks up people as well as the relationship between him and them. Without love, there is no meaning, there is no redemption, and in some cases, there's no point or purpose. Love gives much, and it's very humbling in its own way, because it's not deserved. Generally speaking, when talking about God, love is just simply not. It comes, and it's not really deserved. It's also not handled right either half the time. I'm looking at all the dictions that people have here that, or putting up people on pedestals, for example. Like, you're the number one in my life. That spot should be for God anyway. People are very fallible and make mistakes. Let's see here. Moving on. Let's see here. Genesis 1:11. So God said, let the earth sprout tender vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit according, parentheses, limited to, consistent with, their kind whose seed is in them upon the earth. And it was so. Being there at the start and being there at the finish is something that is both unique but also very appreciated, because God has been very much involved in the process. I'm not sure if there's a word for that or not, but the fact that God is there from start to finish is also very encouraging. Should be encouraging, because that means you're not left alone. You're not left to figure things out on your own, or to even go through them alone. I'm going to refer back to Daniel in the lion's den with his friends. The fact that there were angels there that kept them safe physically, and then also the same from the fire, which killed the men that was tossing them in. I'm not sure how that's possible. Their lack of safety, right? I don't know. The lack of protection, and yeah, it's amazing. With the fact that God recognizes what is healthy, what is not healthy, and in ways that go above and beyond immediate needs to the foreseeable future. Genesis 2:18. Now the Lord said, it is not good, quote unquote, beneficial, for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper, parentheses, one who balances him, a counterpart who is suitable and complementary for him. We're just talking about women. So understanding how things are and what is missing is also incredibly important as well. That is in between being the creator side of God, as well as whatever part that deals with relationships and the family unit reproduction, because that's how more people are made. You know, like men and women, families pop up and kids pop up. Let's see here. Moving on. God knows how to reward. Genesis 15:2. Abram said, Lord God, what reward will you give me, since I am, parentheses, leaving this world, childless, and he who will be the owner and heir of my house is this servant, parentheses, servant, Eliezer from Damascus. And that's asked in a question form, by the way. The fact is, God, I want to say there's a bit of a business side to God, because he knows how to reward, and he knows how to give out appropriate consequences or punishments, or basically knows how to handle situations. And in some cases, in many cases, there is a financial aspect to it. There's money involved. There are goods. There are products, produces. I mean, there's a point where he says that the rain falls on those who are good and evil alike, and then there's another verse that says that the weeds were allowed to grow up with the grass, and when harvest time came, the weeds were pulled out. It was much easier for the weeds to be pulled out away from the grass, because when the seeds and are just popping over the surface, you can't really tell which are weeds and which are actually the flowers and stuff. You might pull up and damage the flowers along with the weeds. So the idea there is, God knows how to reward, he knows how to respond, he knows how to deal with others accordingly. That is very interesting when you try to break down how God deals and handles with others in situations and stuff. There's a lot of time involved. God is not someone who just does things on a whim very quickly. In all honesty, the journey is what defines people. It defines so much. People, the personality, the relationships. It changes not just men, not just women, but it changes nations. Like, there is a lot here that you can go on and on and on about, specifically with how God handles things. In some cases, God will take no disrespect. In the case of the followers of Korah, where they offered a unknown fire to him on his altar, and he straight up told Moses, told his sister Miriam, told his brother, and basically others, basically just said, like, I don't remember the exact words, but it was separating the followers from him from those of Korah, and just straight smoked and burned them all, and there was nothing but ash left. Like, God, and when it comes to attack on his sovereignty, I want to say, if it is a deliberate attack, deliberate offense and breaking of rules, where there needs to be immediate action, God will take action. Another more popular one happens to be when, let's see here, when when the prophets of Baal and Jezebel was there, along with, I'm trying to think here. Oh, why am I blanking on his name? This is awful. The prophet who stepped... I can't remember it. There was a prophet of God, and I apologize that I'm blanking on it, but there was a prophet of God who basically challenged Jezebel on whose God was real. And the end result is basically the priests who served Baal, they called down, or attempted to call down fire to burn up the offering, and failed utterly. And the prophet of God And again, I apologize that I'm completely blanking on his name. I don't know why. I just cannot remember it for the life of me. He made a prayer. Well, he first directed how the offering would be made, and then ordered water to be dumped on everything. And then when he called down the fire, it burned up the wood, it burned up the offering, all of the water, and basically everything in that spot was burned to an ash. And the power of God was on display. However, he ran afterwards because he was afraid for his life. And he sat down later on and just basically begged God to kill him because, well, honestly, he's on the run and he's very much depressed and very much struggling at that point. God and him have a conversation, and, well, not to get off track or anything, it's attack on God's sovereignty is not something that he will take lightly ever, but in some cases he will respond immediately. Let's see here. Okay. Genesis 16:15. So Hagar gave birth to Abram's son, and Abram named his son to whom Hagar gave birth Ishmael, which is parentheses God hears. Also supposedly the leader of the Muslims, like where the Muslims came from. And honestly, that makes sense because, nation coming from Abram, part of God's promise. But I would like to say that it came about differently because of a forced interaction between Abram and his handmaiden back then. So very much different with man, or his wife, attempting to have the line of people that comes after him through God's promise, but in a through forced means. Let's see here. Moving on. Oh yeah. When God responds to other people, he does so in a way that is also very interesting. That shows a different aspect to him because it feels like it's a mixture of several different things here. Genesis 23. But God came to Abimelech in a dream during the night and said, Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, parentheses, as your wife, for she is another man's wife. And the fact that God coming to someone of the Philistines, saying, hey, look, you took this guy's wife, and this is the story goes with the fact that Abimelech said that he basically swore to God that he did not know that it was his wife, that he claimed that it was his sister. And the fact God says, you are not dead because you did not actually sleep with her. There was no sex or anything. So God will respond to others who are, when steps have been taken to upon others' rights, infringement, violating others' rights, or when steps are taken to infringe upon rights or property, God will sometimes take immediate steps as well, even if that is someone who is completely unknown, someone who does not have any, who does not follow, who does not believe in. God will sometimes intervene. And it's very interesting to see and hear some of the stories, to see what is written, to hear some of the stories that have talked about. The Bible is not the only place for these stories, especially if you're looking for something to relate to in your own life. A lot in the Bible is actually hard to relate to, unfortunately. But that's only because it's in a different time, different place, different setting. God will test others when it comes down to faith. Like God puts down tests and obstacles for us for multiple reasons. Mainly, though, it's to test character and to see what we're made of. There's more to it than that. Like, did you get the lesson? Or do I need to send you through the same one over and over again? Or, I'm looking here at Genesis 22:2, which is about Isaac being offered up as a sacrifice, and Abraham just following God's orders and then stopping short of actually killing his son because God wanted him to see whether or not he was sincere, whether or not he was actually going to follow him. Because following God will require sacrifices of different kinds. It's not an easy road. Alright, let's see here. There's also, when it comes down to sacrifice and hardship and these hard situations, the story of Joseph going through his ordeal to be set up and ending up in a spot of authority and leadership of an actual country and helping to manage things for the good of others because of the famine that was coming upon them, the 7-year famine. The 7 years of prosperity and the 7 years of famine, like, that's crazy. 7 years, 360 plus days. Oof. Gotta handle that stuff. And that's 7 years in a row. Yeah, crazy. Anyway, back then, this is a bit of a side topic here, but back then they didn't have the same preservative methods that we do today. You know, freezers. Bad joke, right? They used a lot of salted products for sure. So, beyond that, I don't really know how they stored food back then, but yeah, crazy. Moving on. Directions. Multiple times where God would tell others to return to your country. I'm going to make you prosper. You should go here, settle down, because this is the country that I've offered you. Moses leading the people into the promised land. Jacob returning to his country. There's a lot there. God pointing out direction, telling others where to go and how to go and do things. And it's going to be up to each person individually too. This isn't something that you can simply, this is not a cut and paste that you apply to everyone. This is basically personal that applies to everyone differently. We all have different positions. We all have different gifts that we use, or we should use, but we don't always use. Sometimes we don't know how to use these gifts, and again, it just takes time and experience to figure out what we are gifted with. I mean, not everyone's going to be a leader, and not everyone's going to be any sort of a counselor or anything like that. Some people are good with their hands, and they like to build, they like to create. And back in Moses' time, God gifted some people with some very unique skills, and they became, we don't know if the process was instantaneous or not, but they became master craftsmen at their art. And frankly, I'm floored by that because, like, working with metal, how is that even possible? Like, there was no process, no description on how these people came to their skills. Like, there's nothing. That's not saying that there wasn't any, because before the people the Israelites were released and freed from Egypt, it's very possible that they were workers, because they were forced to work on the pyramids and stuff. So, like, learning trades from there is probably very, it's reasonable to expect that these people who were trained there, they left with skills that they were trained, that they picked up by their time in Egypt. However, it was also said that the majority of the people there who were led into the wilderness ended up dying there, basically the adults and on up, minus like 2 of the people who went into the promised land who came back believing and saying, we should go. Basically, those 2 adults were spared of all of the other ones. So, I mean, master craftsmen, like, maybe their skills were passed on, we don't really know. There's a lot of interesting things to speculate when it comes down to gifts that were passed on. But anyway, that's a bit of a side topic. There's a lot of good stuff there. Let's see. When God describes himself, Exodus 3:14, he uses the phrase, I am. Well, Jesus did too, but I am. And here, the verse is Exodus 3:14. God said to Moses, "I am who I am," and he said, "You shall say this to the Israelites: I am has sent me to you." The phrase "I am" is something that is very particular with God because he exists. He says he exists, and he uses that to describe himself for being here, for being present, not just. If I try to click on this link, it's going to take forever to load up. Let me see here. In context. See if I pull up more information on this. I don't know if it will take forever or not, but either way, describing who you are by describing your state of being rather than your name is very interesting, because we usually say, "Hey, we're this," you know. I'm John. I'm David. I mean, saying your name and offering a handshake is normally what would be expected when you are trying to introduce yourself to others, not just simply saying "I am." it blows the mind when you try to figure out like how God describes himself and how he tries to be involved in other people's lives in a way that is understandable. Sending angels with messages goes so far, but apparently, according to what I understand, angels are downright terrifying. Because they always startle people and they always show up and say, "Do not be afraid." Angel of God in fear. Yeah. I mean, powerful. Someone who's very powerful, who scares everyone when they show up. That's crazy. That's crazy on a few different levels, right? All right. So let's load it up here with the context for "I am who I am." Exodus 3:14. It is related to the name of God, Yahweh, rendered Lord, which is derived from the word Hayah, Hayah, which is to be. Exodus 3:15. To know the names of God is to understand his many attributes and grasp the godly characteristic which the name denotes. Exodus 6:3, 1 Kings 8:33, Psalms 91:14. It goes on. God's name is his self-revelation. This, by the way, is actually from BibleGateway.com. So, like, I'm pulling this particular translation, the AMP version, from that particular site. There's a lot of good stuff here that just describes who God is, and coming at it from, like, this is how God describes himself, a state of being rather than just simply a name, is incredible. Yeah, the fact that it goes as far in depth as far as the holy, the tongues of the Spirit. What's the phrase? Speaking in tongues, and the fact that there is a different language out there that is spoken. That goes to show that maybe his name is not actually able to be spoken in English or in other languages, because it is more of a state. It's more of a representation or a state of being than rather like a name, so to speak, like the way we commonly. I know. Let me see here. I'm trying to pull this up as a bit of an example. David is a name that it means beloved. It's nothing quite like the way it is described here with God as being, I am, the state of being. It's very much, it's simple, it's easily understood. It's not confusing in any way, shape, or form. It's basically it's not in depth. God's description of himself is very much in depth. And it takes time, it takes understanding to understand more and to see what all is involved. To add to this, Exodus 15:11. Who is like you among the gods, O Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, working wonders? So, state of being very awesome on display with works that backs up the image of who you are. Works. That also includes not just action, but words as well. Majestic. Denotes power as well as a impressive display. Something that you don't see too much these days. And it says majestic in holiness. So power plus impressive, along with a purity that you don't see, that's just not visible in today's world. It's very hard for that to be visible because there's so much that has been exposed to be evil or wrong or whatever. Oh, offensive. There we go. Offensive is a very good word that is used today to describe things that are wrong and evil and whatever. Not true, but it's understandable. I mean, not true for most circumstances, but it is understandable because there is a lot of aspects of God that confronts, that breaks, that reveals, that is offensive to many people who cannot take it. My personal, the way I describe it is basically there are people who are there's sensitive people and there are oversensitive people in the way that teeth are rotting are oversensitive. Like, you feel too much, you hear too much. It impacts you on such a degree that it ends up breaking you. Or, more accurately, breaking the unhealthy parts of you. And that's very painful. It really is. You need to get that looked into and checked out if that is actually the case, where you are oversensitive. Okay, going to the next part. Basically, the guardian, the warrior aspect. Deuteronomy 23. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you and fights for you. That's a short verse of it. Deuteronomy. I'm going to look this up real quick. Let's see here. All right. I'm going to look this up real quick. For the Lord your God goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you victory. Deuteronomy 3:22. Oh, sorry, Deuteronomy 24. There's some verses that are synonymous with that, with stand still and I will fight for you, where God goes out of his way to fight for the people because they cannot do it themselves. Also, because God wants to display himself to the other people, and this is at the very end of their life half the time. Parting the waters so the Israelites can walk through, and then, bam, the moment of recognition was basically the end of their life. So when God displays who he is, sometimes if you're on the receiving end, it's literally the last thing that you ever see or experience. And that is very dangerous because when God said to Moses, if you look upon me, you will die, but you can look upon the backside of me, which when he went past the cave that Moses was in, basically put his hand over it. And by the way, that cave must have been enormous. So that means that aspect of God must have been enormous as well. So when Moses could see God, it was only from the backside because his radiance would outright kill him. It's like just being in people's presence alone kills them. It is incredible to note there. But the fact that it ties in with this, but more on the majestic side rather than the guardian, the spirit, the warrior part of God. It's very easy for God to make such an impact in people's lives. I think that would defeat the purpose, though, of us going all on our own journey and discovering who we are and living our life. I think that would be very self-defeating in that aspect because having It's like living someone else's life for them. Anyway, moving on. The angel of God has been mentioned several different times. Exodus 14:19. The angel of God who had been going in front of the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. The pillar of God moved from in front and stood behind them. So God knows how to guard, He knows how to protect, He knows how to lead. And this part of God has been very much talked about time and time and time again. Because God is a warrior, God is also a guardian. He protects what is His. He protects His name. He protects His image. But He also allows these... He doesn't do so in a very smothering sort of way. Like, there's boundaries, there's guidelines, there's structure and a foundation there. So it's not smothering in the way that some people have grown up to be very smothered. Like, you can't do this because it's bad for you. You gotta wait till you're 18. It's like there is a safety net and boundaries, but there's also a physical form of protection that God will give to others. Now, what that would be won't always be an angel. Sometimes it happens to be in guardians like parents. It's going to be more physical. Because, again, the journey, the walk through life is important. And God likes to use others rather than just simply use Himself or angels. Being able to work in people's lives being able to work in other people's lives in the way that He does is very, very much interesting as well as amazing. I mean, because people are very, mistakes, very flawed. Yeah. So, let me see here. The fact that God can fight battles in very much different capacities is also of interest too. It's crazy. The wars that were fought, that were talked about, is what I'm thinking about. All the way from, again, what was his name? Joshua. Breaking, breaking the jars over the torches and yelling at the top of their voices, confusing the enemies, and everyone fighting amongst themselves in the camp below. There's like, 300 men? This is funny. So God knows tactics. He will give advice if you would ask, and if you will seek Him. Also listen to. You can't just simply keep asking a question and not listen to. Like, asking, listening. Like, communication is a two-way street. Let's see here. Exodus 15:26. Saying, if you will diligently listen and pay attention to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in His sight and listen to His commandments and keep foremost in your thoughts and actively obey, that's parentheses right there, all His precepts and statutes, then I will not put on you any of the diseases which I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. God is a healer. God repairs what is damaged, what is broken, what you have incorrectly latched onto, that you have, where that which was a part of your life that you have grown up crooked, believing on it. That is important because that is exactly what is happening in today's world as of right now. I would point to the LGBT community. I would point to those who are trans. I would point to those who have attached to something very important to them, but it's not straight, it is very crooked. That is not to say that it is wrong or evil. It's that when you attach to something and you grow up with it or on it or you're relying on it, it needs to have a firm foundation. And people are missing that. They really are. That's the importance that the scriptures do talk about with a foundation. And it ties in with healing, the healing aspect of God, is because a foundation is needed for healing to work. A very simple explanation is when your bones are broken, if you fall and they break, and they were set improperly. Sometimes they need to be rebroken and then reset properly. That's a very simple explanation that should be very easily understood. Also, keep in mind when it comes down to generational abuse, sometimes it takes years for healing to actually occur, not just simply because it's a process. It's not just a simply one and done. Where you pray for forgiveness and God forgives you. It's not like that. Sometimes there is actual physical trauma, mental trauma, emotional trauma, and it needs different types of healing. Now, outside of what is physical, there is God will be a part of that process if you ask Him to, and if you do come to Him and you take these problems to Him. He will help you deal with them and answer them. But the point is, it usually takes time as well, because the recovery is still very much a process. Okay, let's see here. Also, that ties into recovery to healing is being able to rest, where he talks about the seventh day. Exodus 20:10. I'm not going to read any of that, but I will just say that the stuff that you own, the people that are yours, like family, lives, or your animals, your servants, temporary residents, they need to rest on the Sabbath, which most people would assume to be and believe to be that it is Sunday. There are discussions on what the Sabbath is, and whether or not it's like a Saturday or a Sunday. Like, it's interesting to note that. I think that is not really that important, but having a day of rest so that you can recover from work is still very much important, especially over in Japan, like very work-centric economy. You need to rest. You need to recover. Can't always be working. I mean, that's like that over here with the U.S., but the fact that people have to take pills to actually be functional when they work is pretty horrifying when you think about it. And this isn't just simply a one-time thing. Like taking pills to de-stress yourself, to cope with your job, to cope with your work. It's crazy. It's crazy the lengths people would go to work without actually taking time to rest. That is a part of God's healing aspect, though, that is important to know. Again, I really think that there is a lot here to explore when talking about the different aspects of God. And I'm wrapping things up because it's over an hour at this point. Different aspects of God, it's incredible, it's amazing. There's a lot here that you can learn from on who He is, what is important to Him, what He conveys to us, or tries to at least. Because again, there's so much stuff here that people can honestly spend their entire lifetime learning. Not just simply reading, but living, experiencing, interacting with other people, because different points of views add so much to our life. I mean, it can anyway. You have to be open, you have to be flexible. And to tie this off with, I'm going to go back to a previous video that I talked about where I said I was angry because I just learned about parts of the mark of a man is basically being very flexible and stern. Inflexible and stern. You got to be flexible if you want to learn, if you want to grow, mature, and all that. But either way, God is one of the most interesting beings out there, simply because He cannot be encompassed in one sentence or described in one sitting. It's like it's a process in and of itself. Well, that's it for now. I hope this was very beneficial to you. I hope you learned a few things. I hope there is a lot here for you to think about. That wraps up the second session here on this segment for Who is God, and until next time.